This is the story of the electronic instruments that shaped modern music. Strange machines designed by nutty professors whose quirky bleeps and hums came to rock our world.
Good evening.
The font of all weirdy noises is the Mini Moog, or Moog if you're an anorak. Favoured in the 70s by Pink Floyd and Roxy Music, it became the last word in having a cool wooden box on stage. Designed by Robert Moog, it became an overnight success. But the dawn of Moog experimentation was the king of prog rock, Rick Wakeman. Now he appears on Countdown.
This is my love of my life. Not this actual particular one, because this is borrowed, but I've got 3 that are the love of my life. I used to have 9, but 6 of them were nicked. That ain't one of them, unfortunately.
It's a great machine for generating bass synthy sounds, for electronic blips, for certain signs of cutting lead lines. It's an instrument. You get the best out of it from actually playing it from a keyboard. So people like me, not so brilliant necessarily, we define Moog as makes odd orgasmic groans.
There's no doubting what a sexy mother it is. Check out that walnut panelling.
The thing about the Mini Moog, it was the first thing that was actually portable.
If I do that. So this is the sound source, so you can change the pitch there.
The Mini Moog actually was, you've got this like, keyboard in a little cabinet you could wheel on stage.
And then the sound goes into the filter, and I can change the brightness.
Sort of kills off the theatre.
Here's Keith Emerson, giving it some serious welly on his very own power station. The Mini Moog sought to get rid of such unwieldy machines, but gave the prog rockers new problems all of its own.
And they suffered very badly from picking up RF, radio frequencies, anywhere you played, which used to happen a lot on early pedals in the 70s. Like if you pressed a pedal down and you were in a building that had aerials on the roof, you get the local taxi firm, the local cable company, all that sort of junk. And the best one I ever had was at Crystal Palace Bowl with Yes when we were doing Close to the Edge, and I put my foot pedal down, and it was exactly 5 o'clock on a Saturday, and we got football results. It's great. So we all copied them down for 3 minutes and then started playing. Bob Moog came and saw the show, and it was at half-time, and he came into the dressing room, and Bob's a wonderful character, really wonderful guy, and he said, and I told him about this RF problem before, and he said, I can hear your problem. He said, it is bad, isn't it? I said, yeah. I said, it's almost unplayable. You ended up trying to work with one oscillator or something like that. So he said, I've got an idea. Can I just go up on stage? We used to have curtains in front of the stage. It's Maple Leaf Garden. There's 26,000 people, whatever it was. And he went up on stage during the interval, and we were having a long break, half hour or whatever. We went to go back on stage, and the opening music's playing for the second half. The curtains are closed. I went up there, and he'd got my 2 Mini Moogs that I was totally in pieces on top of the piano. I had a grand piano there. They're just all in pieces. And I said, Bob, we're starting now. And he went, know what it is? And the curtains open, and it's one of the only times that we ever played on stage, yes, where there was a 6-piece on stage, because Bob didn't go, he just stayed there. And you can see like 26,000 people going, who's the grey-haired geezer with the curly hair? What's he doing? And I think it was John who just went up and said, oh, you know, the man who brought synthesizers to the world of rock and roll, this is Dr. Bob Moog. And the place went potty. And he suddenly realised that he wasn't just a sort of an icon for us musicians, but for the kids at the time. He was just like a hero.
Most of the kind of... So that, you know, there's this kind of fetishism of that it produces the real electronic sound as opposed to digital stuff. So I think that's the thing that that it really has given to the world of electronic music. You see Moog on T-shirts. It's become, I don't know, it's a mark of quality and a mark of authenticity.
What else can you do? And this, and this, and this, plus that, and that, and those lot over there can all be connected.
I think the thing about the Moog in general, about Mini Moogs, is it's just pure funk. Those are the sounds that it creates. I mean, in striving to create some sort of approximation of real instruments, you're ending up with these incredibly dirty, filthy, sleazy, sort of synthesized sounds. If you listen to records like Blow Your Head by the JBs, it's just this when you first heard that record, or when you heard it sampled on first Public Enemy record, you're going, my God, what's this incredible sort of sleazy ghetto funk sound? No idea where it comes from. Maybe 10 years later you realise that that's a Moog, and I think that's why people fetishise it now, is because the sounds coming out of that are otherworldly sounds that couldn't have come from any other instrument.
The great thing about it, though, is it's also very timeless, isn't it? It doesn't sound like a particular era, so it lends itself hugely to sampling, which is kind of missing the point, because the thing about the Moog was that it wasn't just the keyboard buttons that you operated, it was all the modulation knobs as well. So weirdly, it's actually very organic, isn't it? You can get little subtleties into it that you can't get with the digital thing, where you've just got a block of sample and maybe a bit of bend on it or whatever.
So you mix that with that?
I think if you use synthesizers, you can get incredible sounds out of them, but you just can't get that dirt, that filth. Yeah. It's like you can if it's like comparing playing a synthesizer to playing a guitar, you can't get feedback on a synthesizer, but you can sort of really rock out, and you can rock out on a Moog.
Thanks lads, but not everyone loves the Mini Moog, you know.
I think the Mini Moog is one of the single most overpriced, overrated heaps of wood and metal I've ever laid eyes on. I don't particularly like it. It can, its limitations are not that fantastic. It sort of, the Moog especially does one sound and it does it well. It's not really that variable. People love it for the bass sound you can get out of it, and for the soaring lead sound that you can get out of it. Well, great, but there's stuff that you can buy that won't cost you 1,200 quid and is a hell of a lot more reliable, that will do that for you in another way itself. And I think it's kind of a bit, it's kind of a bit lazy. I think there's this sort of rich kid kind of approach to it as well from a lot of producers, who sort of feel that once they've sort of started remixing and earning a bit of money, that they have to have the Mini Moog.
Pink Floyd, and particularly Hawkwind, I remember, put them to good effect through all those kind of take-off space sounds that they used to have at the beginning of their tracks. But also, everybody used them. But again, these were all very expensive for a kind of the normal bloke in the street who wanted to get into electronic music. It was very difficult to do that before about 77, 78, just because the cost was so prohibitive. And that was a kind of, the Mini Moog, sorry, I'm pointing there because there's a Mini Moog there, that kind of represented that kind of musical elitism of it at the time. Because there was a very dual feel, in my mind anyway, and a few other people I spoke to. At one point the synthesizer was a very elitist instrument, but at the same time it had so many possibilities that people wanted to get their hands on. So there was a kind of snobism against it, which I suppose was particularly articulated by punk. Yet there were people like me and, I suppose, Throbbing Gristle and Cabaret Voltaire and all my contemporaries who really wanted to get their hands on them and fuck them about, really.
Nowadays, the Mini Moog is part of the furniture, which is handy given how it looks. Still a classic bit of kit, it made a recent guest appearance on Jamiroquai's #1 hit, Deeper Underground, the theme from Godzilla. Oh well.
It did various things, the Mini Moog. One of the most important things the Mini Moog did was, for the first time, the keyboard player could do a solo and could be heard. I know it sounds really daft, but the hammered organ, I mean, it was I remember going to see bands in the 60s and things, and as soon as it came to the organ solo, everybody had to go quiet, so it could just about be heard, and it was really naff. Or if the piano had to go, everybody had to go really quiet, because there's the only way you could hear, and then the band kept going again. I mean, it was a guitarist's heaven. The Mini Moog will cut through concrete. It's the equivalent of the percussion player's tambourine. I mean, you can put a tambourine amongst 5,000 guitar players playing flat out, and you'll still hear the tambourine. The Mini Moog is exactly the same. Suddenly, you had an instrument you could solo on. That was the greatest thing that the Moog brought to keyboards. Suddenly, a keyboard player, really could be heard, and it was. I don't think Bob really realised that when he first put it all together, but nobody has ever come even remotely close to producing a solo synth sound that can do things that this can do.
I love vocoders. I think they're fantastic. They've sort of, from, if nothing more than just the fun of aping your favourite science fiction programs, like Battlestar Galactica. Those, the robots in there with the little bit going, but the sort of that voice You know, I've always loved it. I loved it in electro.
Electro, isn't it? It's gone back
Electro,
to
ELO,
again, yeah.
ELO as well. You know, Mr. Blue Sky. I used to sit there as a child waiting for that bit to happen. It's like, you know. And the funny thing is, something that used to scare the living daylights out of me when I was a child was Sparky, the magic piano. If that came on the radio on a Sunday, I'd just scream. I'd stand there screaming in the room. My mum and dad had to turn the radio off. This vocoded piano, it's like voice coming through the strings of a piano. You know, ironically now I can sit in here quite happily late at night playing with a vocoder and I don't scream.
I would have loved to have been there when the vocoder was first invented. It's a fantastically exciting sound. It's also a very bizarre sound as well. It's not just I mean, the sort of ability to make someone sound like a robot, for example, has been around for a long time before the vocoder. You know, the sort of Metal Mickey kind of effect was had been done for years. But with a vocoder, you suddenly turn the voice into a synthesizer with it.
The children's TV theme tune Sparky's Magic Piano is often credited as the first well-known use of the voice distortion box. In fact, the first vocoder was developed by the Bell Phone Company in the 1930s and used as a scrambling device for phone calls between President Roosevelt and Churchill during the war. In the 1960s, transsexual avant-garde composer Walter, then Wendy Carlos, used one on the soundtrack to A Clockwork Orange. In 1975, avant-garde composers ELO used one on Mr. Blue Sky.
I think, like a lot of people, the first time I properly heard the vocoder would have been on ELO, on Mr. Blue Sky, the vocoder solo, which was just, Mr. Blue Sky repeated through a vocoder. And, as a kid, you think this is the most amazing, unreal, weird thing you've ever heard.
Hey there, Mr. Blue, we're so pleased to be with you. Look around, see what you do. Everybody smiles at you.
Then you get a little bit older and you start to hear other people's record collections and you realise that actually it got used to death in terrible prog rock records. The great thing about it now is it's been totally reclaimed in dance music, and it's another thing that had this incredible elemental funk to it that people didn't really understand at the time, but in retrospect we can see, particularly compared to the kind of fetishizing of real sounds now, you can actually see that it was something that had an incredible character of its own. It basically just modulates the human voice and gives it that kind of Dalek groove.
The classic use of the vocoder would be to take, say, a sustained string sound as your input and then use a voice as a carrier to modulate that. I mean, you can do it the other way around, but basically you're taking the characteristics of the voice and morphing those, mutating them with the characteristics of, for example, a sustained string. And that's how you get these wonderful kind of Sparky, the talking piano effects. And, it just is a brilliant effect to use. I think it perhaps epitomizes the marriage between human and technology that we were talking about before, because everyone likes to hear a sung line and a melody and a vocal and lyrics, but this enables you to put a techno skin onto it, if you like, and sort of force breed them together, and the hybrids that you get out are pretty interesting.
One of the practicalities of it, he has to sort of have normally the microphone's up a bit higher, sort of Lemmy style, so the spit doesn't run down, because that's when the electrocution happens. So you have to have it that way so that the spit kind of goes back into your own mouth, which means it's probably going to need one of those suction things you have at the dentist to get this.
And in New York, we bought one a couple of years ago, and we went to do this show. And as we were doing the sound check for it, some spit got down the tube, must have run into the box, blew it up. There was an explosion, and smell of rotting fish. Then I could see a spark come out of there, and it went into my mouth and came out my elbow. We all get electric shocks, but
the lights were down really low. They were testing all the lights, and so this lightning. Everyone just looked around because it was just like this blue piece of lightning just came out straight into his mouth.
And I did a special body pop movement that came out my elbow.
Ian, what's his Ian Curtis kind of dance, yeah. Involuntary. Mind you, his was involuntary too, wasn't it?
Electronic bands add N to X use the vocoder as a personality in its own right.
On the new single, we use this new computer program called a vocal writer, which is it's basically a kind of strange piece of software where basically you put in the words and then you have to kind of work out the musical pitch and notes of it, and then you can basically drag it and do whatever you want to it. But you could basically, for the first time, make computers kind of sing. And there are various kind of character voices, and the ones we use on the single is Sarah and Ralph. And Ralph is particularly lonely. And Ralph.
We've got an example of Ralph.
I'm down to ashes.
And Sarah is.
We haven't got Sarah on here.
Haven't you got Sarah?
Oh, yes,
you have. So I think that the kind of what it is just that it's really sad. You've got this thing actually doing very emotive. You can get it to do very emotive human things. In other words, it's got control on it for vibrato and tremolo and pitch, and you can virtually make them kind of sing operatic.
Should I make him do it now?
Things. Yes.
The wobble.
So you can sort of do anything you want with it, but it's got this completely soulless thing, and I really like the debate within synthesizer music about what's got soul and what hasn't. And for us, we couldn't give a fuck about soul because I don't think kind of soul necessarily exists too much in modern music.
Silly metal Mickey voices fell out of fashion, but enjoyed a comeback in the 90s thanks to the Franche.
I like Air's use of vocoders. I think that's some modern music that uses the technique well. I mean, it's sometimes it's used in a kind of cod way. You're almost not making a proper song. You're referring purely in a pastiche sense to stuff that's gone before. But I think they straddle the divide there and get it right.
I really like the use of them at the minute. There's loads, I like vocoders, they're funny.
It's interesting because, you get Cher, her voice, and Posh Spice, Posh Spice's latest, her thing with...
Out of My Mind.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of what I'm just about to say, because now, the modern day, what they're using now, although it's not, it sounds a bit like a vocoder, and you go, what's they doing on that? And actually, in fact, is a program you can record onto your hard drive, record Posh Spice's voice, and you see it all up on your computer, and you put it through this thing called a pitch corrector. So if you're not very good at singing or whatever, you set whatever track, whatever pitch control, what pitch the key, what key the song is in, and it goes along, listens to that particular audio track, and then corrects it. Now, but what people have done, which is what they've done with her, I'm not saying she can't sing or anything like that. Before I get
it's an effect. You're talking about the effect of it.
Around and kicking me. I'm saying it's the effect of it. Which, if you go a bit crazy with it, or tell it
if you
the
turn
wrong
all
key,
the knobs up, if you turn all the knobs up to full, basically, it has an effect like a vocoder, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Well, they got there in the end, didn't they? In the 21st century, vocoders are still with us, unlike Scurvy or Cadbury's Rum and Raisin, who aren't.
In 1970, the idea of hearing these robot voices, like the sort of the cantina music from Star Wars, that's like, wow, that's so futuristic. But if you're looking back now, the idea of what we in 1970 thought the future was going to be like, with us all with our jetpacks and our wristwatch TVs, is so funny that it is in itself quite charming.
Yeah, but a lot of the records that get over now, particularly the kind of Daft Punk school of things, harks back to that, and that's why it's charming, and that's why it's got an appeal of its own.
We're retro.
Yeah, well, that kind of thing, because we're actually stumped for an idea of what the future's going to sound like now. It's gone beyond what anybody can predict.
People like vocoder sounds, they like Moog sounds. They no longer want the future. We just want cutting edge nostalgia.
Sounds might have moved on. Drum sounds might have moved on. This might be out of date a bit, but the human voice is still pretty much the same. And we're still sitting around asking ourselves, how can we make this vocal sound more interesting? How can we blend it into the electronic sounds? The vocoder, in its broader sense, which is mixing and mutating sounds together, is a very powerful technique. And I've heard examples of drum beats vocoded with human voices, so you get a kind of singing, talking drum in an electronic sense that, blow your mind. So there's still a lot of mileage there.
The DX7, the finest synthesizer ever created by man.
It's the worst synthesizer known to mankind. It's a disgusting piece of shit.
I'm going to play that same thing again, because I can't think of any Elton John now. I wish I could think of some Elton John songs. Like, what was that? Oh, well, how did that... Oh, never mind, anyway.
Sexier than Miami Vice, the DX7 was the ultimate 80s gizmo. Unlike the humble electric piano, the DX7 had no knobs for boys to fiddle with. It was smooth, it was sleek, it was black. Verily, it was the Top Gun of home organs.
It is quite a sexy keyboard, actually. It's kind of got these sort of green sort of membrane sort of keys over it. Well, the Mark I did. I think like anything, you know, whether it's a keyboard or a motorbike or a car, Mark I's are generally the best of everything, and that is certainly true with the DX. Is that you had this green sort of silky membrane over it, where it was kind of those 80s kind of buttons that weren't actually sort of profiled off the surface. You just kind of touched them, and they had the effect.
When I first heard it, I couldn't believe that it wasn't recordings of sound. I thought, my God, that's a bass guitar, isn't it? And all this sort of thing, and that's a choir, and you know, I couldn't believe it was purely a synthesizer.
It appeared on top of the pops more often than anybody else in the 80s because they had the DX7 in the prop cupboard. And whenever you needed a keyboard, well, you'd be parked behind the DX7, and it didn't matter whether you were, you know, Depeche Mode or Sade or whatever, DX7.
It's quite a nice appearance, and with this sort of lovely sort of metal kind of brown case, a really beautiful keyboard, one of the loveliest feels of keyboard in it. I think that's why so many people used it as a master keyboard, and probably why it was the top of the pops keyboard as well, because, you know, it kind of felt and looked sort of pretty good. But I haven't slept with mine.
The DX7 was the first keyboard to sell over 1 million and single-handedly killed the Fender Rhodes electric piano, the classic keyboard of the 1970s.
I think it is officially the world's best-selling keyboard. I don't know if it's been surpassed now, but it is, you know, up to this point it is. And it just kind of represented a complete rethink in the sort of forms of synthesis at the time. It was the first time, I think, the general, well, not the general public, but the general sort of public of producers and musicians took a leap away from analog synthesis into a kind of an altogether sort of more daring sort of method of sound creation.
Sleek and sexy as it was, the DX7 was impossible to use, except in idiot mode.
I think what was so daring about the DX7, well, the whole range, was the sort of rethink in the approach to synthesis. So it was the first time they stripped away all the sort of lovely knobs and faders, which up to that point it had been all about. There wasn't a single patch lead, you know, in kind of evidence anywhere on it. It was just all this sort of new kind of menu system where you'd look down and you had a little screen with one parameter on it at a time as to what you were changing about the sound's character. And it shocked a lot of people, and I think, you know, nobody apart from Brian Eno and later me learnt to program it, and I think that was kind of what made it such a sort of daring instrument for anyone to start using.
For a lot of people, it was an easy option because it had, you know, you had instant electric. It was famous for its kind of electric piano sound and its strings and brass. But it was almost, unless you devoted your life to it, it was almost impossible to edit. I mean, even though the DX7, the basic synthesizer, the structure, the architecture was fantastic, and the way it created the sounds, but it was so difficult to get at and so unuser-friendly and uninteractive that very few people even bothered tweaking the sounds even in the slightest. So you began to hear exactly the same sounds on every record, and for a lot of people that was what defined electronic music at the time. And to me that was just like home organ, a kind of posh home organ in a sense.
I remember when the Yamaha DX7 came out, and I did try one. I think I probably used it once on something just because I found a sound I liked, but I was never a fan.
There's a kind of a sound of 80s records which is kind of characterised very much by the DX7, especially kind of mid-80s sounds. And because it was such a commercial success, that every other synthesizer company wanted to try and copy it. And the development of interesting synthesizers seemed to stop for a while.
It always struck me as being an instrument that session musicians use. You know, if you'd ever be in a studio and there was someone in the studio next door, they'd always have a DX7. And that really put me off because I thought, oh God, they're all over everything, you know? And I found the sounds a little too thin and gidgy sounding for my taste. I like bigger, warm sounds. I think Yamaha made some great things over the years, but I was not a fan at all of the DX7.
There's a kind of thinnish, kind of stabby, I don't know, it's kind of cold, but not cold in a good, not good cold, you know, bad cold. Cold that was trying to be warm, do you know what I mean, as opposed to cold that was trying to be cold, which is very different, you know. And again, it kind of, the tyranny of the keyboard player kind of returned a little bit, you know, and we were very anti kind of that at the time, you know. I mean, we were, you know, 3 chords were far too much, let alone a bloody, you know, whole keyboard full of chords, you know. So, you know, and I think people that I worked with and people I liked, were still kind of, we're avoiding those kind of cliches, you know.
The epic sound of the DX7 became a staple of big rock acts in the 1980s, such as U2, Dire Straits, Phil Collins and Foreigner.
It's so identifiably 80s, you know, whereas I think things like all the analog things sound fresh now. I don't think the digital things like that sound fresh. I think they sound, you know, sort of dated in a way. But I guess it's all how you, I mean, like you know, it's all how you use the stuff, really. That's why I'll check it out. But I mean, that was a revolutionary piece of gear because, you know, it was the first, and it was MIDI, and, you know, it was just, you know, it was, you know, I used to use it a lot, but not on any of the special records, you know, not on the best records. It just was ones, you know, when I try to do like a rock record that sounded like Foreigner again, you know, those kind of sounds. Joshua Tree, probably Genesis, Peter Gabriel, it was like that kind of sound, you know. But I guess now, actually, if you go back and now you really affect the sounds, I'm sure. And also, if you were a real genius with it and you were able to manipulate the sounds, which you had the ability to, you could probably do some great sounds.
The horrible sounds of the DX, which I talked about earlier, were these sort of the A&R pianos, which were these, which is complete sort of Elton John kind of, you know, sort of territory. And the other thing that it was sort of so bad for was its kind of emulation of instruments. I mean, like, you know, this is supposed to be a saxophone, which, you know, Kenny G would like, but I don't. So, you know, that's not really where its strength lies. The sort of strength of these kind of these synths is in their sort of, you know, their sort of evolving kind of, you know, sort of textures that would grow out of them. Which are just far more interesting and kind of, you know, quite unique in their sound. Also, their lead sounds were really brilliant. I mean, you had loud sounds out of it as well, but, you know, these kind of... which are kind of... Although on that kind of analog tip, there's something very harsh and very abrasive about them, which kind of, you know, kind of puts them in their, you know, completely in their own sort of territory, really. And that sort of biting sound was something that was also added here, which was the touch sensitiveness of it. Now, with your early sort of synths, your early analog synths, it doesn't matter how hard you hit it, you get the same sound out of it. With these, as you could kind of start off with these sort of this very sort of soft sound, and it would sort of end up, you know, you could kind of really develop it along it, and then, which makes it really useful for expressive kind of playing. You know, just very sort of inspirational to kind of play almost.
The DX7 as a classic machine changed the face of keyboard players out of the solo thing of being able to to play because it could do everything from your great clavinet sounds to brass sounds and all sorts of things. And the string sounds that weren't too bad. Still sounded a bit farfeaserish, but weren't too bad. And it was a very clever machine. I mean, very, very clever. Changed the whole face of keyboard.
This is a Fairlight. It was a whole new breed of synthesizer.
The first thing I ever saw was like a careers lesson at school. One of those sort of school programs about, I don't know what the hell they were teaching us about Midure for, but Midure was on this program saying, well, and this is a sampler, and he was showing the Fairlight and the little screen, and I just remember sort of, I think my heartbeat visibly raised. I just thought, oh my God, that's what I want. That's what I want. And he was like going, ho, into it or whatever, and going, ho, 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 and it's just, I couldn't believe this thing, that there was something that could actually do that. I was so like, oh my God, and it was doing the sound of church bells and cars racing by, and I couldn't believe it.
The Australian company Fairlight was set up in 1975 and named after the hydrofoil that crosses Sydney Harbour. Founders Kim Ryrie and Peter Vogel immediately began work on attempting to sample a dog bark. It took 2 years to achieve and blew the mind of new romantics everywhere.
It came out in the early 80s. I first used it in about 1982, 1983. And it was a different type of synthesizer. Basically, it was the first sampler. And it sampled at a very low rate. I think it's about 8-bit. But it was a revolution because you could take sounds or voices or any noise or an old synthesizer and put it in here, and you would get a crude version of that spread all over the keys and be able to play it. It came with a vast library of big floppy disks about this big, and each one had several sounds on it, and they were things like flutes and bagpipes and all kinds of strings and orchestral things that were previously unavailable, apart from on the Mellotron, which was really, you know, the earliest of all those sampling instruments.
One of the most striking things that you'd notice about the Fairlight, wherever you were seeing someone playing it, is it came with this sort of computer screen that always had fantastic sort of numbers running up and down it, and all this sort of wealth of information going up and down it, which you were assuming the keyboard player was interpreting to somehow kind of boost his performance in some way. As it turns out, I think it wasn't. I think it was the demonstration mode.
Very useful for layering and making textures and orchestral things. Not very many people used it. It was hideously expensive. I mean, now, the technology that's in this, you could probably buy for a few £100 in a box that big. But then, it really was, this one and the Synclavier were way ahead of everything else out there.
In spite of the creative possibilities of the Fairlight, the only sample anyone seemed interested in using was the barking dog.
Dogs became such a thing that, what was that little, that was like a kind of toy sampling keyboard you can get, and one of the presets was a dog. And it's like, nobody would
your Casio tone.
That's the Casio tone, yeah, the VL tone, was it?
No, Casio
The
tone.
Casio tone.
They were with their little sort of samba drum.
Yeah, but I mean the dog was in there, yeah, and God knows why. I mean, there's a valid reason for dogs to be on the Pet Shop Boys record. It's called Suburbia, and dogs are in the lyric. But when you've got Christmas carols being played on a dog noise, why? What for?
Because they didn't know how to use them. And it was probably a
tried it in
preset.
Happy Hardcore, but it never worked.
We used to spend hours and hours, the producer we were working with, Alex Sadkin, and I, just putting things in and seeing how far we could take it. What else would Fairlight do? You know, could we really get away with sampling that and putting it in? And you know, I used to rip up bits of paper and make them sound like rockets and put them in there, and have about 40 of them on the screen, and we just spend hours saying, well, which one really sounds more like a rocket? You know?
Vince Clark, who's an artist on mute, was one of the first Fairlight owners in the UK, and he used it and to really good effect. And I think it was an amazing. I mean, it was hugely expensive at the time. If you compare for what it did to what you can buy now, it's, you know, you don't even want to think about that. But the point is that nothing else. It was the first really usable sampler.
You could play 8 different sounds at once, as I remember. Had this brilliant sequencer on it, which was really dead easy to use.
The sampling around it was terrible, so the sounds were all muffled. But interestingly enough, now you can buy sample CDs to put into like modern samplers of those sounds. Those very woolly sounds. It's quite a machine, really. I remember when I got my first demonstration with Fairlight, because it was a very small company, and they were virtually hand-built. So the guy came along to the studio and set it all up, and it just didn't look like anything else. I mean, as you can see, it's more like sort of 1970s office furniture. So I was used to all these other things with knobs and dials, and I looked at this and I thought, typing, I don't know about that, and there was a little keypad. And then the screen itself, of which sadly this isn't one of the originals, used to have a light pen, and you could move things around with a light pen. You could get the waveform of a sound, and you could actually move it and alter things, which inevitably was a disaster, but it was fun to try. So it just wasn't like anything, and the thing that appealed to me most of all was there was basically an 8-track recording machine in there, so you could build sequences and have things repeat at different times and patterns through it. So I felt more autonomous. You know, everything else was going on in the studio, and I'd have my headphones on, building my own little song in here, and no one would know what was going on until I finally pressed the button, and it was all in sync with the track, and it seemed like I'd done 4 days' work in an hour.
Leaving the Duranis with plenty of time to do their hair.
Did you have to buy yours?
Well, you mean as opposed to, was it given to me? Do you know anyone who was, well, apart from Peter Gabriel, I know he was probably given one, because it's his cousin that used to sell them. No, I had to buy mine, yeah. It was ridiculously expensive. And then sadly, actually, at Christmas time, I had a flood in the basement, and it drowned.
The sort of things you say of great worth that came out of Fairlight abuse was his production on Frankie Goes to Hollywood.
Well, the whole ZTT thing was very Fairlight based, wasn't it? There were loads of really good Fairlight records there. Propaganda was brilliant. Art and Noise were pretty good when they were on ZTT. They kind of
Moments in Love.
Yeah, Moments in Love, really good. Wasn't the whole of Relax made on a Fairlight? I think it was. Even the bassy thing, the whole thing was put through a Fairlight, and that was really good because it had the capacity to just, you know, Relax is essentially a load of sound effects built over an essentially
taking that thumbed one-note bass line and then perhaps
absolutely
squaring off the wave, making it sound a little bit more clipped, perhaps giving it that sort of high energy, owl snorting kind of edge.
Yeah. Relax, don't do it when you want to go to it. Relax, don't do it when you want to come home. Relax, don't do it when you want to suck it to it. Relax, don't do it when you want to come.
I think the thing about Fairlights is essentially they're crap.
Yeah.
And I mean, you listen to Art of Noise. I mean, they've made some great records, but when you're listening to things like Close to the Edge or Close to the Edit, and you've got these like broken glass noises and dogs barking, and it's like, wow, this is great. They can make a dog bark and play a tune. It's like, yeah, give me a piano.
Cars starting off as well.
Yeah.
But it was pretty, because that had its own. I mean, the sampling was not particularly realistic, was it? It was very low definition. So consequently, the sounds all got dirtied up, which brings in that kind of indefinable funkiness that you got in those records.
I think it's the beginning of things being digital and rubbish. Really, I think it takes away from the funk. I think the Fairlight is a technological cul-de-sac.
The Fairlight was superseded by newer, faster samplers, and wasn't helped by the fact that it never really worked properly.
I used to deal with the people at Fairlight quite regularly, because the one thing was they were the only people who knew how it worked, and it did come with an instruction manual like a telephone directory, but somehow it was written by aliens.
The Fairlight broke down all the time, software problems for days, and we just used to have to wait 2 days for the stuff to arrive, to be repaired, and they were in their last sort of days at that particular time. So I ended up spending about 3 or 4 weeks down there, which was extremely nice. Played a lot of golf, 3 days in the studio, a lot of golf. It was really nice. The Fairlight was a good machine. I must admit, if I could find one again that was working in good working order, I'd have one, because I like instruments that produced a unique sound, that you could say that sound belongs to that instrument, nobody else has got even close to that. And I have to say that in their own way the Fairlights did do that.
The classic Simmons sounds.
The sound of the early Simmons kits, you know, for certainly there's a sort of 5-6 years, can sort of be summed up in one word, and that word is that's about it. The bass drum sounded like that, the snare drum sounded like that, and the toms was the same but a longer version of that. And yeah, it is the EastEnders sound, the beginning of EastEnders or the end of EastEnders sound. That is the Simmons sound.
The Simmons drum kit's hilarious. I mean, every drummer had one, and every track you heard on a record, apart from you did do do do, you know, which was a bit of a sadness, because the actual Simmons kit could do so much more than that. But it was just something that everybody sort of latched onto and went, oh, that's what it would do, you know.
The Simmons drum kit was invented by a man called, wait for it, Dave Simmons.
He was the fantastic British inventor. You know, much like Dyson or someone today. He had this vision of electronic drums and really, you know, really took it on. There was a lot of opposition to it, and he was pretty much out on his own.
I'm Dave Simmons. What I used to do was electronic drums.
Complete nutcase. I got on really well with him. Yeah, I mean, I was never a drummer, but I have a fascination for people like that. I have a fascination for people who can visualise something that they don't really know what it is they're trying to produce.
And it really took off because we went to a trade show, and I'd made 3 drum kits. One was a hexagonal-shaped drum kit, one was a heart-shaped drum kit, and one was a bat-shaped drum kit. The idea that they would appeal to various drummers, because at that time we were saying we could make drum kits any shape you like. We made one for Richard Burgess. What he did Einstein a Go-Go, made out of heads, which were glass fibre heads, and he smacked those on top of the pops. So we went along to a trade show showing these weird shaped drum kits, and everybody pretty much liked the hexagonal shaped drum kit.
As well as producing drums that looked like skulls, Dave was keen to make his trade show appearances as crazy as possible.
I think we had a Midas room once where we had a soundproof booth that was done out like an Inca temple. We didn't sacrifice anybody, maybe we should have done.
You had these sort of strange hexagonal almost pads instead of the sort of, you know, your sort of deep snare and your bass drum and all this sort of stuff. And I think it was just an attempt to almost kind of combine what was good about synthesizers and the electronic side of music, to giving that to something that drummers couldn't have up to that point. You know, drummers, I don't know whether Dave Simmons himself kind of felt a bit left out by the likes of, you know, maybe the keyboard player that he had in his band, but they created this sort of monster.
I was introduced to Dave Simmons by Richard Burgess, who produced the first couple of Spandau Ballet albums. Well, produced the first one and didn't produce the second one by the sound of it. He's a great mate of David's, so I went up to his place in St Albans, and I think I had the 3rd SDS5 ever made. I think the first one he kept, you know, for himself. The second one went to Mike Oldfield, and I had the 3rd one. As I say, that was made out of solid wood then, and used it on Top of the Pops and all that sort of stuff. Chant Number 1 was the only actual record we recorded with it. It took a lot of getting used to. I mean, because with real drums it's all about input and output, and you know, the harder you hit it, the harder you kick down. Whereas, you know, getting the sensitivity right is difficult, because you're used to that sort of relationship between this and that. With electronic drums and Simmons, you had to relearn all that. Otherwise, I mean, if you really played through them, I mean, these were a later development. I mean, the originals that were actually solid wood with riot shield on, you could really just damage your wrists and your tendons and all sorts of things. As I say, the biggest problem I found was the kick drum, just smashing things to bits, because after years of playing small places and no amplification, you were well used to bashing it, and with these you just used to break them.
At that time, we didn't think that we had to have a head on the drum. We did in the end, we gave in the end, but to start with, one of the fast response, it helped the electronics work really quick, and it gave the drummer something really fast to play off. The downside was the drummers would still smack hell out of this stuff, and because it was right shield material, the thing that gave was their wrists in the end. If they couldn't just lighten up a little bit, a lot of them can't, smack hell out of this thing and go, ouch.
You look at them and you think, yeah, Phil Collins, Roger Taylor and Duran Duran, Shalimar maybe. Yeah. It's just top of the pops moment where everyone's got these terrible hexagonal things making crap noises.
It was the way that you could say to the world that you were modern. It doesn't matter whether you're like a kind of incredibly like dyed-in-the-wall regular band. If you had the Simmons kit there, it showed that you were a little bit forward-looking. The thing with the Simmons was it was the trigger. So you would hit the pad, and it would then feed through, and it would play a sample, and the samples were adjustable and all the rest of it. Now, there were pros and cons to this. I think New Order used to have on the side of the stage, and when Peter Hook didn't have anything to do, he'd go over and he'd hit it.
I saw the Thompson Twins, Spandau Ballet, and Aswad, actually, on Top of the Pops, all using the Simmons kit.
Spandau Ballet obviously picked up on it because they could have a pure, white, very clean-looking drum kit on stage, and that fitted in with what they wanted things to look like. The reggae guys picked up on it. We had a red and orange sunburst kit like a Tequila Sunrise. They liked that look.
But more recently, I've seen people like Bjork had this fantastic drummer that was on tour with her, and he still used a Simmons kit. I mean, they're such a sort of funny-looking thing to have on stage. They're really bizarre, especially when you got these sort of multicoloured symbols that they did with them as well. I mean, it just looked like a collection of UFOs that you were sort of hitting around you. They're absolutely fantastic in their sort of style. And I think it's that sort of memory of seeing these bands on Top of the Pops using it, and me just transfixed. But I didn't care who was singing. I didn't care who the bass player was. All I cared about was looking at this drum kit and going, what the hell is that thing?
The cameramen on Top of the Pops were zooming in, oh, something new. And also the guys that were buying the going, something new, there's something new here.
A real drum kit, whether it's a real drum kit or a real piano or a real vintage synth, is infinitely variable. There's no way you can kind of faithfully reproduce the sound of it, especially with early 80s electronics. And so I think what people had to do was embrace the sound of the Simmons for what it was, and kind of look at it as this sort of unique sci-fi kind of sound.
Like any groundbreaking invention, the Simmons drum was prone to, well, teething problems.
Relying totally on electronics at the time was, was difficult. I remember a gig we played in Portugal where the power is notoriously not great. It was pretty much pitch to voltage stuff, so we were only getting 90 volts, and the kit was just going and farting really, which was ugly. Another start of a tour, I had a fan on the same plug board as the Simmons, which was just sending spikes, and for the first number it played itself. It was just going off, and I was just sort of sitting there as a spectator, really.
One of the major innovations of the Simmons drum was its ability to sample.
I think the spiritual ancestor of the Simmons drums were those like feels like I'm in love, boo boo. Those little accessories from the old disco records. Because they're really, really good at just adding stupid little percussion bits. A bit of a breaking bottle, a barking dog, boo boo, anything like that. They're fine for. But when it's a proper drummer,
what you end up with is Roger Taylor going, wild boys, wild boys, wild boys. It's awful,
and nobody needs that.
The Simmons company folded, but Dave has continued to invent new technology.
About 3 years ago, I couldn't earn any more money out of making electronic drums. A friend of mine had a beauty salon, and he was doing false nails, and he couldn't train his girls to do false nails because they're using live models. So he asked me, we've been fishing buddies for years, to come up with an invention where he could train his girls. So we invented this, tooled it up, patented it, and now we're selling it to 20 countries around the world. It's a very realistic hand, it's got fleshy fingertips, plug-in nail shapes, and it allows people to learn how to do nail extensions without hurting anybody.
Spandau Ballet are still touring as Hadley, Keeble and Norman, and they've still got their beloved Simmons drum kit.
If I'd been in a band in the 80s and I was the drummer, I would have wanted a Simmons. is a real fashion statement, you know. It was like, he's got a Simmons, you know, and there's this sort of possibility of standing up behind the kit and sort of having your sort of pads mounted around you so you could sort of strike them very kind of heroically.
Loved it. Loved it. In fact, I think we used a couple of sounds on the new album from that.
What do you like about it?
It's just so plastic. So pretend drums.
Best thing about the 303, the road from London to Glastonbury is the A303, and it's very meandering.
It was like a rebel within itself, do you know what I mean? It wasn't conventional bandy music. It was like, what the hell is this sound?
The 303 was, it had great weird, and it was the weird, it was like the sort of, the instrument sort of would take over, basically.
I went to see Black Dog Productions, and the finale was the 303 to the front of the stage, and three of them leaning over each other like they were playing Twister, so they could each operate a knob on this thing. And because it was, you know, three pairs of hands instead of one, it actually did take the 303 into a different dimension.
Two 303s.
In 1982, Roland produced a machine that attempted to emulate the sound of a real drummer and bass player. It was called the TB-303.
The Roland TB-303 bass line was designed to play the bass line. It was because, you know, drum machines get rid of drummers, bass line get rid of bass line players. So all you do is you program your little pattern into it, and it gives you this kind of relatively fat, you know, moderately bass guitar sounding thing if you use it properly.
But what was, when it was originally designed, it was meant for you know, solo singer-songwriters to have some sort of approximation of a band playing behind them.
Yeah.
So you can imagine some guy standing at Baker Street Station playing Streets of London with his little 303 with Berlin down beneath him.
Yeah.
And they only made them between 1982 and 1984.
Yeah.
And they were phenomenally unpopular. Because they were crap.
They were rubbish for the purpose for which they were designed.
Exactly.
However, the purpose for which they were not designed was turning into acid house.
By accidentally turning a knob on the 303, a seed was born.
The 303 is so difficult to program, and the manual translated from the Japanese is so particularly opaque that you're reduced to randomly pressing stuff and seeing what happens. And basically, out of that came acid house music. Out of this machine, Marshall Jefferson and his crew were wigging out and seeing what sounds they could get out of it. And it's like, hey man, this shit's got a mood. Let's put this out. And that was Acid Tracks by Future.
The whole trend comes from DJ Pierre and Spanky going into the studio with this box which they discovered and just making records for DJ Ron Hardy to play at the Music Box in Chicago. Now he was a lot more of an insane DJ than Frankie Knuckles. He was on drugs a lot of the time. He played all his records speeded up. It was just very fucked up sort of music.
303 is an auto bass accompaniment, like a low budget bass line accompaniment for, you know, for musicians. I guess that's what it was invented for, and then didn't really do very well until around 1988-87 when Future did Acid Tracks.
They just fiddling with this machine until they got the sound. Which apparently originally was 130 BPM, which was, and they slowed and Marshall Jefferson persuaded them to slow it down to the slight pitch, the speed it is now. They came out with this track, Acid Tracks. They only called it Acid Tracks because it wanted to sound, what sounded like acid rock. There's no other sort of connotations at all. And they just gave it to, they just played it on cassette, and people got going mad for it.
It spawned a whole style of music based around this thing, and essentially, a lot of the time, based around this thing going wrong. You know, sort of sounding, you know, making the sort of sound that it would make when you leave it in a cupboard and drag it out after years, and it sort of tends to have its own little patterns left in it, which nobody wrote, and that's what, you know, that's often the sound of acid house. Not all of it, you know, some of it's far more structured than that, but some of the better sort of rolling, you know, 3-time over 4-time sort of stuff is just sort of random, which is something, you know, I've been defending myself against for years with electronic music, that
machines don't write music. They don't write the music, you have to do it yourself. But in this case, the 303 does write acid house on its own.
The 303 was transformed overnight from a wimpy beatbox for talentless buskers to the hottest gear in town. And because Roland had taken the stupid thing off the market, people like Orbital were reduced to buying them off strange men.
We bought one and they had a pub band. I bought it off a pub band guy. And he had, what did he have? West End girls and West End boys, and it was dong, dong, dong. It was like that. It was like, no, this is
painful.
This is not how you're supposed to use it. You're supposed to use it in a ragga sort of style.
No, that's exactly how it was supposed to be used.
That's
why it failed in 1984.
Speaking personally, when I first heard acid records, I was at university, and you heard about acid house. I mean, I didn't know how you made it. I didn't know how where the sound came from. But you started hearing records like Armando, Land of Confusion, like Mr. Fingers, Acid Attack, like acid tracks, Mike Dunn, Magic Feet, and you're hearing these records, and like, wow. To me, it was epiphanal. It was like some of the most funky music I'd ever heard in my life. I hadn't discovered acid house, I hadn't discovered ecstasy. I just listened to these records and, oh my God, this is amazing. It was just such a driving, incredibly sort of individual sound.
The great thing about it is that
must have had a huge effect right across the board when people started hearing this.
The great thing about it was the first time you hear it, you realise that this is the first time in a very, very long time. You've heard something you've never, ever heard before. Music being made in a completely different way through technology that has never particularly existed before. 303 wasn't sophisticated technology, but it was just the way it was put together.
It's obsolete technology. Yeah, that's what's so good about it.
I've only ever heard it being used for its intended purpose of playing a bass line once, which is on good old Heaven 17 on Let Me Go, where it plays a bass line, and I think that's the only time it's ever been used for that purpose on a record. Everywhere else, it is the sound of acid. It is the squirrely noise.
In the 90s, the 303 fell out of fashion.
There was a kind of fallow period for the 303.
Fashion, totally,
yeah, but when it came back into fashion, it really came back into fashion. And, hence Fatboy Slim, everybody loves the 303. Which is kind of true, isn't it? Because it has that kind of Pavlovian response. Once you've heard it, you only need to hear a little bit of acid burble, and it really gets you going.
And, now actually, I just heard like the Aaliyah record, and a lot of the hip-hop guys, the R&B hip-hop guys now are actually using 303s like on slow beats and using some of the sounds, and it sounds really fresh. So I think it's one that sort of aged well. I mean, it has its ups and downs, and about 5 years ago it was like incredibly popular, and Norman Cook would use it and everyone used it, and now, it's one of those things that will always work, that there's always a spot for it in a record. It just adds that sort of funny, weird, vibe to a record.
We still use these machines to an extent, but it's true to say that hardware musical machines are under a lot of threat from software and digital technology. And what that means is that a machine like this and a machine like the 303, which if you wanted to go and buy this now, it's going to cost you £1,000 because people want them because they make acid house and you can make a record with it. So what you do is you get a bit of software which sits in your computer and gives you the same functions as this, makes the same sounds, and you can buy for about £100.
We've been around a long time, and playing live and stuff like that from about 11 years ago, and we did used to get interviewed, and people were very technophobic about that, and going, oh, well, the computer, somebody wrote, which sort of sums it up really, oh yeah, our LP sounds like we've turned the computer on, went off and had a cup of tea and then let the computer do its stuff. Which is obviously people are a lot more clued up to it now, and obviously that they know that that's not true. But in that case, it could be quite true. A bit of neglect doesn't do it any harm at all.
Yeah,
like the corking tune.
It's a bit like good wine. You leave it in the cupboard for a few years, and it comes up a really good acid house.
Anyone can make an acid record with a 303, and can now do it for the price of a pair of Nike trainers. This means the professionals have to go one better.
One particular track which we use the 303 in still, after all these years, You know,
we did something that I've always wanted to do, and in 5.1, and that's, you know, like with the modulating synth, as you know, as we've been talking about, is put the 303 4 times, one in that speaker, one in that speaker, one there, and delay them all by, you know, 4 bars each or something like that, so that as this one rises up, that one comes behind it, then that one, which is quite, you know, really weird sort of
like
circular.
a round, isn't it?
Yeah, it's like a 303 round, just like a medieval round.
Oh, yeah.
Ooh.
One take on electronic techno music is that it's a conversation between man and the technology that we've created. I think music's always been about man's attempts to kind of interface with the environment. A lot of music is actually about natural sounds. Birds are imitating car alarms nowadays, which is also a clue on what's going on. But nowadays, it's techno time. Techno sounds in the environment all around you. You can't get away from it. Some people don't really get that, but go and listen to your fridge. Your fridge makes sounds. Go and do it now and understand what that means. A conversation between man and machine is techno. Techno in the pure, true, deep sense. And these machines encapsulate that.
When we play and when we make tunes, or when people make tunes, it's the subs that you're feeling, because that's something that will touch your chest and shake your legs. And if it's a B line that's incredible, like if we play at the end or we play at Fabric and certain places where they have quality sound systems, you can feel that shit come. It's like a tidal wave. You know what I mean? It's like, it's an unbelievable feeling. I mean, when we make music in here, because it's like metal trusses all over the place, it shakes. I've had untold people say, "Can you come and turn it down, please?" Because it's just one of those things that actually travels, sound travels, but that travels straight through you. Do you know what I mean? And the 808 is just like classic. 808 and 909 kick drum. Do you know what I mean? With the 909 kit, it's just bare essentials. It's like, if you're driving a car, you've got to have a steering wheel. If you're making music, you've got to have an 808.
The Roland TV 808 drum machine was invented in 1981 by a small team of Japanese designers. Abbreviated by musicians simply to 808 and immortalised in band names such as 808 State, it brought new, harder drum patterns to music. These in turn formed the basis for the stripped-down urban soundtrack of the early 80s, electro, hip-hop, and then with a 909 model, house music.
It's such a ubiquitous sound in dance music, electronic music, but certainly the electro period of, say, the early 80s was a key time for this machine. And I guess probably the record that blew my head and a lot of other people's was Planet Rock, Bambaataa and the Soul Sonic Force. And that whole sound of electro was very much inspired by this machine.
The night we went in to produce Planet Rock, I had done another rap record before with Bambaataa called Jazzy Sensation, which was pretty successful. That we had used a live band. So Planet Rock was the first record I made with a drum machine, and we didn't even know, no one we knew had one. So we had to advertise in the Village Voice. We found an ad in the Village Voice, man with drum machine, 808, man, programmer with 808. I'll never forget it. It was like $25. And he came up, and, I told him what to program, and then Bambaataa came up with an alternate beat from a record called Super Sperm by Captain Sky. So we did the beat, and then we did, I had, some ideas like the bass sort of that went with the kick drum. That was something I came up with to just sort of reinforce it and to give it a bass line, because I wanted a bass line, but we didn't want to come up with something that would distract from the beat.
And it dared to be sort of dirty and things. It was just a bass line and a drum machine. Those two little bits of equipment, picked up from a second-hand music shop or something. Recorded, it could be recorded on a 4-track. It wouldn't matter, and it was that sort of real do it in your bedroom for next to nothing thing that I think was quite good. Yeah. Just really rough and ready sort of music, wasn't it? Didn't have to have a lead vocal, didn't have to have chords.
When I took it home, I knew. I said to the woman who was my wife at the time, I said, we've made musical history. I really knew. That was before the rap. It was just the track, and I just said, it sounds so different. I was like, oh, it's like what Talking Heads are trying to do, bringing in like Bernie Worrell, but we've actually done it. It sounds like true. It's like the Bronx meets, Greenwich Village, uptown and downtown. and that was without the rap. So we knew, I knew immediately. I mean, on some of those records, when I did Walking on Sunshine, IOU, Confusion, I knew that they were, that they were the shit, basically.
Whilst Arthur Baker produced legendary, unique and uniquely legendary records with his hired 808, other producers hated the thing.
This predated our use of it predated the 808 by about 4 or 5 years. I think the 808 came out in 82 or 83 or something. And so when that came out, it seemed like a bit of a cop-out to me because as well, here we've got this amazing machine and we can fine-tune our sounds exactly how we want them. And then there's just like a preset machine came out. Although I thought the sequence on it was fantastic, I didn't really like the sounds that much at the time. I thought they were a bit wimpy,
Prior to the 808, drum machines were in a pretty bad state. That's not to say that there weren't some good records that were made using those machines. I mean, Sly and the Family Stone were one of the earliest groups to use drum machines. Even Family Affairs got a little drum machine rattling away in the back. And they tended to be the kind of add-on section in a home organ. And then drum machines like the Dr. Rhythm sort of came out of that, but they were very much on that kind of cheesy bossa nova home organ tip. And then the contribution of these machines was that they freed that up into a much weirder and electronic sound and way of programming. So the whole way that you step program rhythms on here was very much different to what had gone before. It was interactive, it was programming, it was direct. And then the sounds had this kind of strange quality, and you can listen to the Roland machines and hear the evolution of sounds from the original kind of organ drum machine sections through to the 808, which was kind of, the pinnacle of that development, I guess.
Basically, when you go out in a club, you just want to hear something hitting you. You want to feel it in your chest, you know what I mean? And lately as well, the way the scene has gone on and type of production it's gone into, it kind of took out that 808 bass out of it for a little while, but it's back even stronger.
There we've got the bass drum playing on beat 1, on the 1. And if I change the decay setting, you can actually hear how that starts to spread out and get fat and take over. That, in 1, is your Basshead Wet Dream, the sound that launched tens of thousands of records. So I've got a bass drum playing on the 1. Let's put in one on the next beat up. Okay, so we've doubled that. And the third one. So there you got your basic kick drum engine to it. Now we just put in the snare, and the snare usually plays on 2 and 4, which sounds like this. Oh. Slightly offbeat rhythm there, not quite sure what I'm doing, but that's one of the wonderful things about this is you can just be hitting beats more or less at random, not sure what you're going to come up with, but if it sounds good, then you use it. And that's a key feature of these Roland machines. They're so easy to use that you could just play with them and get shit out that you would never actually think of programming in a million years.
The thing is with 808 basses is it doesn't have to be a straight sound feeling. You can distort it, you can re-record it, you can put it through a processor and make something else out of it.
What was interesting in the development of hip-hop and electro was it was a kind of reaction to the sloppy drummer, the human drummer who did, tend to speed up and slow down and had a kind of... It became unacceptable because you wanted that kind of machine techno pulse to keep you rocking and solid. And obviously Kraftwerk and the whole German electronic sound had a big influence on that. And when that met the black dance funk aesthetic with Bambaataa and Planet Rock, and reaching back to P-Funk and Sly and the Family Stone, as I say, you did get an excellent mixture of sort of human and techno, the man and the machine, with the funk in there. So it's strange to say that a machine can funk, but it can if it's used right.
Previously, throughout the 80s, we've been stuck with really thwacky, big, splashy snare drums, the sound of like big stadium rock, because the design objective seemed to be, let's try and get this to sound as much like a real drum as possible. And the 808 snare doesn't sound like a real drummer, but it does sound really funky. It's really crisp, and
it is the snare of house music, isn't it?
I think one of the most telling sleeve notes in 80s music is on the first record on Def Jam, which is TLA Rock and Jazzy J, It's Yours. The credit is reduced by Rick Rubin. And I think in the 80s, where production became so much a part of pop music, whether it was Jimmy Jam, Terry Lewis with soul music, or people like Trevor Horn with pop music, suddenly music was reducing itself. And you've got hip-hop, and then later house music and electro. It was all reductive music. It was getting back to basics, back to the street.
In the late 80s, the 808 was superseded by the 909, the standard kit for producing house music.
The 909 is like pop music. Everyone uses the 909. It's like, you know, that's like house, commercial house. Every record has a 909 on it. The 808 is still a bit, you know, it is more of an underground thing. It's probably more difficult to get now. And it's just, you know, I don't know, it's quirkier. It sounds like a machine. You know, it sounds more like, you know, little, you know, like Japanese guys in a factory making these weird sounds. You know, it's just a great instrument because you can make weird sounds with it, and you know, it doesn't date. That, you know, that's the sign of a great instrument, that something that actually doesn't date, that when you put it on again, like even now, you put an 808 on something, it still sounds fresh. It's, you know, it's almost 20 years since we did Planet Rock, and it still sounds fresh. If you put it in the right context, it sounds amazing.
What we'd experienced from the majors was we'd had all this kind of pop crap shoved down our noses, and like, this is how you make music, and I suppose it was almost like a rebel among the cause, where everyone thought, fuck the majors, man, let's go and do our own shit. And this is where kids, you know, young kids, like, enough of us just started to experiment with different sounds.
Nobody really knew what to do with them when they first came out. I mean, you just had a rough idea of what they did, and you just, the more you played with it, the more you realised it could do.
There've been samplers around for a good 15, 20 years, but they were very, very expensive. They were the sort of thing that Sting could afford, and he had 3, including one in the bog, but no one else could afford them. So about 200 grand, that kind of amount of money, which for most people is completely out of reach. So when manufacturers started making this kind of creative, functional power available to people in a smaller box with a much smaller price tag, it actually kick-started a revolution in making music.
In 1986, the Japanese company Akai launched the first in a series of affordable samplers. The S-Series, as it was known, spawned the dance music revolution, and the S1000 became its icon.
The concept behind the Akai samplers was, well, what did you get when you bought an amp? You got a disc of brass and strings. I mean, people were obsessed with trying to recreate brass and strings and piano sounds, do you know what I mean? And they all sounded shit. And, you know, I think, so it wasn't the machine itself, it was the way people used it, the people's vision and how they saw what they saw. The possibilities they had were, in a way, probably much greater than the people who built the synthesizer.
It was very basic. I mean, it looked like this, but it just had one little kind of screen running through it, and basically it was all numbers. And I used to look at it and get a headache.
I think it's really interesting. You've got this machine that, when it first became quite popular in the late 80s, led to actual changes in the law. And you know, before then, there was no law to deal with sampling, because people didn't even know it could be done, and that you could take the whole backing track of a record and replicate it on your hip hop record. And so, you know, and they changed the law after, famously after De La Soul took a couple of seconds of the Turtles and played it at the wrong speed on 3 Feet High and Rising, and ended up losing an enormous chunk of the royalties on the album. But then in the late 80s, I believe Polydor had 3 lawyers working full-time on James Brown's back catalogue, just chasing people who'd sampled James Brown.
I mean, I think it's quite good, actually, that the way that the manufacturers now are making software that you can cut your loops up and rearrange them, so it's not just a case of kind of nicking James Brown.
I think definitely the next step, the S1000, and with the sort of Akai worship of dance music came, as you say, with rave, and as that metamorphosed into jungle, because rave was essentially hip hop speeded up for ravers on drugs, and making it more faster, more exciting. There's a lot more of a multi-racial mix at these clubs than perhaps a lot of the pure acid house clubs in London. So there was more of a hip hop and ragga feel to the music, and it was just having to get faster and faster and faster. And then there were all the sort of little sort of E tricks coming in there, like you say, the bubblegum vocals, and people time stretching everything up to fit in with the speed, but not actually knowing how to use their samplers well enough to keep it in tune.
You had an era when people were deliberately pitching up the records that they played very, very fast. So they chipmunkized, they became high-pitched, and they kind of went out of tune and developed a new sound there. Then, following that, you had an era when people were deliberately making the records to sound like they'd been pitched up too fast. And those records would in turn be pitched up even further, so it would be the whole time. And it was great.
In those days, it was a type of frustration, I suppose, with just like, yeah, it was excitement, you know, and it sounded good then, you know what I mean? The little Mickey Mouse vocal thing kind of sounded good because everyone was doing their vocals at normal speed.
Sampling, I think, it, sort of inspired, you know, endless sort of genres of music. Early hip-hop really heavily based on it because you took the fundamentals of hip-hop, you know, being able to, you know, sort of cutting between two records to extend your loops. Well, now you just put it in a box and it was extended for you and you could go on. So it sort of went from there through sort of early house music, you know, and, you know, sort of taking, whether it was sort of they were taking disco loops or vocal loops. It was more sort of vocal loops than, you know, disco loops weren't something that came into house music a lot later. So you can watch it through, you know, watch it develop through that music up to today, where, you know, the whole kind of breakbeat scene, drum and bass scene, the two-step scene, and even more so house today is completely based around the use of a sampler.
Musica is really, really interesting because it's like a kind of rewind culture that we've gotten ourselves into, which is really good, in the sense that you've got a video player and a 6-year-old, and they can watch Star Wars 1,000,000 times over, and you can understand, they understand a level of detail that when we were kids, we just don't have or aren't able to appreciate.
This is what we call the mother keyboard, and this is where we'd break up. This is where we break up the breaks, so the breaks in like 1, 2, 3, 4, sorry, 3 parts. Yeah, so you've got a 3-part break there, but it's not chopped completely. We could actually take that break, the whole of that break, and split each individual kick, snare, roll and hi-hat. And there, hence, if we go into this, you can actually see that's the break. And this is how it all starts, really. Do you know what I mean?
When you really got the switch from rave into jungle is when producers like Rob Playford and Digo from 4Hero, Goldie started actually dissecting the breaks and thinking, well, here we've got a breakbeat which we've been playing maybe twice as fast as it should be, but we can make it a lot more exciting if we actually went back into the sampler and started editing.
You're talking about things that I haven't done yet.
Goldie used it with Terminator 2, where he actually took one break, and I suppose this is the way you could say it. It's the same break, but it sounds like the break is displacing itself, so it's actually going up in pitch. But as it's going up in pitch, the time stretch effect was like a metal sound. So you'd have like this 1 sound, 2 sound, 3 sound, 4 sound, and it was like almost like it was going up, but it was still staying in time.
And then as it became like hip-hop DJing, you know, when everyone wants to go one and wants to do something faster, better, quicker than the next person.
It was just an experiment, you know. People just used to go in there, knock up a beat, fuck about with it on the sampler, and it could have been a mistake, you know what I'm saying?
But also with time stretching, not only that, you can time stretch something. Say if a vocal was too fast, or you'd sampled like a jazz track and it was too slow or too fast, you could time stretch it to fit in to that BPM. This is what time stretching was about, you know what I'm saying? So it was actually, you were actually able to move the vocal up or down to actually sit within the track. And that's basically, that's the basics. It's a sequencer that allows you to hear the sound, to see the sound on the screen, and to actually relay it to a mixing desk board, which would be something like this, or there's many other different makes. And from there, you'd probably have, I don't know, maybe 10 or 16 different sounds, not all simultaneously running at the same time, but maybe. And then that's how you build the basics of a track.
What I like about the sampler is the fact that you can discover more detail within a particular piece of music by chopping them up, reverting them, and doing all sorts of kind of things. So you get this brilliant kind of internal depth.
So you'd have a break, then you'd line it with a hi-hat, then you'd have a string, then you'd have a groove, and then you'd probably add a vocal, and then you'd have a bass line.
The S1000 completely democratised the whole idea of making music, because whereas before you had samplers like the Fairlight that were like these huge sort of white coat boffin, incredibly expensive and actually not very good machines. Here we had something that actually could do what you wanted it to do, and if you could spend the time to sit and work out how to use it, could put making music within the average person's grasp. And you don't even need to be able to play music particularly well. All you need to do is have a good idea, have good beats, and you could do it.
What would originally have been just a piece of music that you play, and you can then take it and revert it and almost destroy it and kind of control it, which I'm sort of interested in. I think that's the main benefit and the revolution of the sampler, definitely. You know, and obviously we used to use it as part of our kind of setup, but now it's much more about kind of these sort of instruments. But I think as sampling goes, I think it's just complete genius.
That sampler was a way of manufacturing our own stuff, putting it out, getting it out to the public, and doing our own promotion. Do you know what I'm saying? And it did. It helped, and it's still, it's still in the studio now, man. It's like one of the furnitures, one of the boys.